My friend Marcus crossed a financial line about 5 years ago and didn't notice it. He just realized one Tuesday that he hadn't checked his bank account in 3 weeks. That was new. For the previous decade of his adult life, he'd refreshed his banking app multiple times a day, the way some people check the weather. The fact that he'd gone 3 weeks without looking wasn't because something dramatic had changed about his life. He still had the same job, the same one-bedroom apartment, the same girlfriend, the same Honda. The only thing that had changed was a number on a screen, and the number had crossed about $50,000 in his investment account. That $50,000 didn't make him rich. It didn't change his car or his clothes or where he ate dinner, but it changed something inside him that he hadn't noticed yet, and the people around him had started to respond to that change before he could name it. His landlord brought up renewing his lease 3 months earlier than usual and dropped the proposed rent increase. His boss started asking for his opinion in meetings where he used to just take notes. And his mother, who'd been calling him about money for 2 years straight, quietly stopped including him in her quarterly worry sessions about whether he'd be okay long term. Nothing visible about Marcus had changed. Internally, something fundamental had, and the world was reflecting it back to him. This video is about 3 different net worth levels where the world starts treating you differently. None of the 3 are about being rich. They're about specific moments where a particular kind of fear ends and a particular kind of self-respect begins. The change other people notice is almost always downstream of a change inside you that you might not even recognize when it happens. I'm Tom. This channel is about real personal finance for normal people, the kind that actually works instead of the kind that gets you to click on a thumbnail. No motivational fluff, no fantasy returns, just what the math actually does over time. If that's what you want, hit subscribe. Today I'm going to walk you through the 3 thresholds with the latest 2026 data, what changes at each one for real, and the part nobody warns you about, which is also why the wealthy people in your life often seem stranger than you expect them to be. Stick with me until the end because that last section is the most useful thing I'll say in this video, and it's the opposite of what most personal finance content will tell you. Before I get to the 3 levels, here's the financial picture of the country you actually live in, according to the most recent Federal Reserve and bank rate data released in 2026. About 24% of American adults report having no emergency savings at all. 59% could not cover a $1,000 unexpected expense without going into debt. Only 55% have 3 months of living expenses saved, which used to be the bare minimum every financial planner recommended. What that tells you is that financial fragility is the default condition of American adult life right now, not the exception. Most working adults are not building wealth in any meaningful sense. They're running on a treadmill that keeps them roughly in place. When I describe the 3 thresholds in this video, the first thing you need to understand is that simply getting off the treadmill is itself the first level, and most people never get there. The dollar amounts I'm about to give you won't make headlines, but they're more meaningful than they sound because they're invisible to most of the country. Level 1, the sleep threshold. Around $50,000 invested. The first level isn't about being rich, it's about a specific kind of background fear stopping. I call it the sleep threshold because the most accurate description I've heard from people who've crossed it is that they started sleeping through the night. Here's the math. The Bureau of Labor Statistics' most recent consumer expenditure survey puts average annual household expenditures at $78,535 a year. That breaks down to roughly $6,500 a month for a typical American household. 6 months of that runway is about $40,000. Once your liquid and near liquid investments cross around $50,000, you have what the financial planning textbooks call a real cushion. You can lose your job and not immediately lose your apartment. A serious medical bill stops being a choice between paying it and feeding your kids. And you can say no to your boss without rehearsing the conversation in front of the mirror 3 times first. This is what happened to Marcus. He hit $50,000 in his mid-30s after a decade of disciplined saving that started with him living with 2 roommates and driving a 15-year-old Honda. The change wasn't dramatic from the outside, it was dramatic on the inside. He told me later that the most surprising thing wasn't the feeling of having money, it was the absence of a specific feeling he hadn't realized was always there. He stopped flinching when an unexpected expense showed up. He stopped negotiating with himself about every dinner out. The grocery store stopped feeling like a math problem. The treatment change at this level is almost invisible from the outside, and that's what makes it so easy to underestimate. Nobody throws you a party at $50,000. There's no bank tier you unlock, no special card in the mail. What happens instead is that the people around you start responding to a calm you didn't know you were projecting. Landlords negotiate harder against people who clearly need the apartment. Bosses lean on people who clearly need the job. Once you stop visibly needing those things, the negotiation tilts in your favor without you saying a word. The world doesn't see your bank balance, it sees the way you carry yourself. And at $50,000, you start carrying yourself differently because you can. The other thing that changes at this level is who you stop being. Until you cross $50,000, you're statistically part of the most fragile group in the country, the 59% of Americans who would have to borrow money to handle a real emergency. Once you cross it, you've quietly stepped out of that group and into a different one. Nobody notices your membership change. You notice it once you realize you've stopped flinching. There's one more thing worth saying about this level, because most personal finance content underrates it. The sleep threshold is the only one of the 3 levels where the change is mostly internal and almost entirely free of trade-offs. Both of the next 2 levels come with real costs, including lifestyle compression, social isolation, and identity questions. This first one mostly just removes a low-grade dread that you've been carrying without realizing it. There's no downside. If you ever get the chance to talk to someone who just crossed $50,000 in investments after years of being broke, they'll all describe it the same way. They sleep better, stand a little straighter, and start speaking up at work without rehearsing what they want to say. Nothing else has changed. The fear has just stopped running in the background, and they didn't know how much energy it was eating until it was gone. Level 2. The self-fueling point. Around $500,000 invested. The second level is where the math itself starts to do meaningful work alongside you. I call it the self-fueling point because it's the moment your portfolio's annual growth catches up with your annual contributions. From here forward, the work your money does at night equals or exceeds the work you do during the day to add to it. Here's the math that matters. At a 7% real return, which is roughly the historical long-term average for a diversified stock-heavy portfolio after inflation, a $500,000 portfolio earns about $35,000 a year on its own. That number is bigger than the entire annual savings of almost every American household. The median family in this country saves about 4% of disposable income, which on a typical salary works out to maybe $3,000 to $5,000 a year actually going into investments. Once your portfolio is growing by $35,000 a year on autopilot, you have crossed an invisible line where your money has stopped being something you have to push uphill. It's starting to roll downhill on its own. My friend Margaret crossed this line last year. I've talked about her on this channel before. She's a 52-year-old office manager in Ohio who's been quietly saving 18% of her $80,000 income for over a decade. That discipline finally pushed her into the 400,000s last year, and her portfolio's returns in a normal year now produce more new money than her contributions do. The first time she actually noticed was when she opened her year-end statement and realized her portfolio had grown by $32,000 over the year against $14,000 of contributions. Her money had outproduced her saving for the first time in her life. What changes at this level externally is more visible than at level 1, but still mostly behind closed doors. This is the level where banks stop treating you like a number and start assigning you an actual person. Chase Private Client opens its doors at $150,000 in qualifying assets. Bank of America's Preferred Rewards Platinum tier kicks in at $50,000 to $100,000. Most full-service brokerages and wealth platforms have a meaningful tier of service that activates somewhere in this range, usually with dedicated phone numbers, fee waivers, and the kind of small attention that adds up to a few $1,000s a year in costs avoided. None of this is glamorous. It's just the financial system signaling that you've become worth being slightly nicer to. There's a real shift in 2026 worth knowing about here. Starting this year, JP Morgan Private Client is restructuring so that customers with less than $750,000 in qualifying balances will now be assessed a meaningful fee that didn't exist before. The threshold for being inside the favorable side of that line has moved upward, in real time, in the direction these thresholds always seem to move. The system isn't standing still while you climb, it's slowly pulling its better doors farther back. That doesn't make crossing the lines less worthwhile. It just means the people who tell you X dollars is the magic number are usually working from older numbers than they realize. The internal change at this level is bigger than the external one, and it's also the one Margaret didn't expect. Once your money is generating real returns on its own, you start measuring your life in time rather than dollars. You stop asking whether you can afford something and start asking whether you want it. You stop saying yes to overtime because you need the money. You stop turning down weekend trips because the trip would mean 2 missed shifts. The portfolio is doing work for you that you used to have to do for yourself. That extra room shows up in your decisions before it shows up in your lifestyle. There's a related data point that surprises almost everybody. According to Northwestern Mutual's 2025 Planning and Progress study, only 36% of American millionaires with at least $1 million in investable assets actually consider themselves wealthy. Almost 2/3 of millionaires reject the label. That's not them being humble. It's because crossing $1 million in 2026 dollars feels different from what your parents told you it would feel like. The treatment from banks improves. The internal shift toward measuring time over money is real, but the feeling of having arrived never quite shows up. That feeling, it turns out, depends on different variables than the headline net worth number. Level 3, the optional work line, around $2.3 million invested. The third level is where work becomes a genuine choice rather than a structural requirement. I call it the optional work line, and I've crossed it myself, which is the only reason I'm willing to describe what actually happens there with any honesty. The math is straightforward. Charles Schwab's 2025-2026 Modern Wealth Survey, which polls Americans every year on what net worth qualifies as wealthy, currently puts that number at $2.3 million for 2026. That number is interesting because it lines up almost exactly with the math of full financial independence for a typical household. At a 4% safe withdrawal rate, $2.3 million produces $92,000 a year of inflation-adjusted income indefinitely. That comfortably covers the BLS average annual household expenditure of $78,535, with about $14,000 a year of cushion for healthcare surprises, taxes, or lifestyle drift. In other words, the country's perception of wealthy tracks closely with the mathematical reality of no longer required to work. What changes at this level internally is the thing I most wish someone had warned me about. The work pattern that got you here is hard to put down. You spent 20 years building habits around earning, optimizing, and accumulating. Then one day the math says you don't need any of that anymore, and your habits don't update. I personally said, 1 more year, twice after my math said I could stop. Both of those years I worked at full intensity for income that made essentially no difference to my long-term trajectory. The first part of crossing the optional work line is realizing that you've crossed it. The second part, which can take years, is letting yourself act like it. What changes externally at this level is interesting and not always good. People do treat you with more deference, in part because you stop needing anything from them. There's a quiet authority to people who genuinely can't be leveraged with the threat of a job loss or a denied raise. Negotiations get easier because you can walk away. Conversations get more honest because you have no incentive to pretend. But there's also a strange isolation. You stop being able to relate to coworkers about the things they're stressed about, because their stress hasn't been your stress for a while. Family members start looking at you differently, sometimes warmly, sometimes with low-grade resentment that has nothing to do with you and everything to do with how their own situation looks by comparison. The other thing nobody warns you about is the planning horizon shift. Below the optional work line, you make 5-year plans. Above it, you start making 30-year plans, because your money can credibly fund a 30-year future. That sounds great, except your brain isn't built for that time frame. Almost every major decision you've ever made was on a 5-year horizon at most. Suddenly extending that to 30 years is harder than it sounds, and it leads to a particular kind of paralysis I've watched a lot of people experience. The freedom is real. The frame for using it is something you have to build separately. The thing nobody tells you about any of these levels. Now here's the part most personal finance content will never explain, because it's not flattering to the genre. The 3 thresholds I just walked you through are real. The treatment changes are real, and the math is verified. But none of these levels actually transform you into a different person. They magnify the person you already were. I've watched people cross the sleep threshold and become more generous with their friends and family because the safety cushion let them be brave with their money for the first time. I've also watched people cross the same threshold and become tighter, more paranoid, more obsessed with protecting what they had. Same number, opposite behavioral outcomes. The threshold magnified what was already there. The self-fueling point produces similar bifurcation. People who were curious about the world before 500,000 used the freed up bandwidth to learn new things, travel more deliberately, deepen their relationships. People who were anxious before 500,000 used the same bandwidth to find new things to worry about. The Northwestern Mutual data showing that 64% of millionaires don't feel wealthy is partly explained by inflation, but mostly explained by the fact that anxious people remain anxious regardless of the bank balance. The optional work line is the most striking version of this pattern. People who had a sense of identity outside their work before crossing it tend to find the line genuinely liberating. People whose entire identity was their job tend to find the line genuinely disorienting. The math is the same. The number is the same. What differs is the person who arrives at the number, and the person who arrives is the same person who started the journey, just with more financial leverage. This is the framing that gets lost in almost every video on this topic. The treatment changes do happen. The math is real. But the actual quality of your life on the other side of each threshold depends almost entirely on who you've been becoming during the climb. If you don't like how you carry yourself at 25,000, the levels won't fix that. If you do like how you carry yourself at 25,000, the levels will magnify what's already working. So the right question isn't only what number you're chasing, it's also who you want to be by the time you arrive at it. The first question gets answered by the math. The second question gets answered by the kind of attention you're willing to pay to your own character while the math is doing its work. Both questions matter, and most personal finance content only takes the first one seriously. If you remember one thing from this video, make it this. The 3 levels are useful targets because they describe real changes in how the world responds to you. But none of them are finish lines. The actual finish line is becoming someone whose life makes sense at any of the levels, and who doesn't need the next one to feel okay about being on this one. If you want me to walk through the specific saving and investing behaviors that get you to the sleep threshold fastest, regardless of where you're starting from, hit subscribe, because that's the next video, and it's the most actionable one I've made in a while. I'll see you in the next one.